You know that feeling when someone asks you for a small favor, and instead of honestly checking if you have the energy, you hear yourself automatically saying yes before you've even processed the request. For years, I thought this was just part of being a good person, until I discovered what psychologists have been quietly documenting for decades about people who compulsively please others and struggle to set boundaries. Here's what makes this fascinating. According to research from behavioral psychology, we need to distinguish between two completely different motivations that our culture constantly conflates. There's genuine altruism, which is that warm, expansive feeling of choosing to help from a place of abundance. And then there's fawning, which is something else entirely. You can be the most helpful person in the office and feel completely resentful, or you can say no to almost everything and maintain deeply loving, respectful relationships. Anyway, the difference isn't about how generous you are. It's about whether the commitments you make actually align with your capacity and values. Think about that person you know who rarely helps but shows up 100% when it matters, versus someone who agrees to everything but always looks like they're on the verge of a breakdown. The Big Five personality model measures this with traits like agreeableness, asking questions like, "I sympathize with others' feelings," or "I am interested in people." And what researchers found is that people can score high on agreeableness, but have completely different levels of internal stress. What we're really measuring isn't kindness. We're actually measuring the fear of conflict masked as politeness. Now, to where it gets psychologically interesting and honestly a bit counterintuitive, look, people who struggle to say no aren't just trying to be saints. They're often managing a high-stakes safety operation. Seriously, if you look at trauma research, the folks who can't refuse a request are usually hyper-vigilant when it comes to reading the room and managing moods. Basically, they fix things for others to keep themselves safe, not just to be nice. Don't get it twisted. These people aren't weak in any way. They just have a survival instinct so strong that prioritizing their own needs feels like walking into a fire. Honestly, I spent most of my 20s convinced I was a pushover or needed to just toughen up. Like, why couldn't I be that person who sets a hard boundary without their voice shaking, or those people who leave work at 5 p.m. without feeling a crushing sense of guilt? But here's the wild thing. The actual science says people who are comfortable saying no have something a lot of people don't. They can tolerate the discomfort of disappointing someone. No panic, no desperate scramble to over-explain or apologize for having a limit. Psychologists call it differentiation of self. Basically being able to stay connected to someone without merging with their emotions or feeling responsible for their reactions. And hey, before you roll your eyes and think, "Wow, that sounds selfish," just hang on a sec. Studies on interpersonal dynamics have found that people who are okay with setting boundaries usually end up with healthier, more sustainable relationships than those who always say yes. You know why? Because when they do agree to something, it's from a place of honesty, not out of a covert contract where they secretly resent you later. It completely flips the script. They put whatever social energy they've got into commitments they can actually honor. People who respect them, value their time, and don't expect them to light themselves on fire to keep others warm. "You can't pour from an empty cup" isn't just a bumper sticker. It's straight up survival for your mental health in a world that will take as much as you give. Here's something I found particularly striking when I dove into the academic literature. According to research on occupational burnout involving thousands of participants, researchers identified people who were highly competent but reported low self-efficacy. These individuals were helping everyone else, yet felt like they were failing. Sometimes they were performing worse than people who did the bare minimum but protected their focus. What this tells us is that the human capacity for service is limited and variable, and preserving your energy isn't a character defect. It's a legitimate survival strategy. Now let's talk about the authenticity piece, because this is where the data gets compelling. Dr. Gabor Mate once said that when a child has to choose between authenticity and attachment, they will always choose attachment. And modern neuroscience backs this up. When you are constantly suppressing your own no to secure a connection, performing expected social scripts, your brain loses the bandwidth to recognize your own needs. This is the mental state where you lose touch with who you actually are, because you've spent so long being who everyone else needs you to be. People who say no aren't missing out on connection. They're creating the conditions for real connection. And honestly, here's something we rarely talk about, but desperately need to. Being a yes person doesn't automatically mean you're a good person, but it also doesn't mean you're immune to the physiological risks of repression. Research from psychosomatic medicine has documented that chronic suppression of anger, that feeling of swallowing your words to keep the peace, affects the immune system and nervous system in ways that can genuinely impact long-term health. Studies have even linked compulsive people-pleasing to autoimmune issues and chronic fatigue over decades. So, the question isn't how helpful are you? The real question is, are you resentful of the people you claim to love? And does your current lack of boundaries align with the life you actually want to live? Because here's what the psychological research reveals when you strip away all the cultural noise about being selfless. People who thrive while maintaining boundaries tend to share certain traits. They have strong internal values, they're comfortable with friction, they've developed what's called self-respect, meaning they know their worth isn't calculated by how useful they are to others. They're not afraid of someone being mad at them because they've learned that a moment of awkwardness isn't a catastrophe. It's just information about what they can handle, what they value, and where they draw the line. This doesn't mean they never feel guilt. It means they've learned to distinguish between the temporary guilt of saying no and the chronic pain of abandoning themselves, even when praised by others. If you're someone who's always felt guilty for wanting to turn down an invitation or say no to a project, psychology actually has some validating news for you. Research on assertiveness consistently finds that those who practice saying no demonstrate higher levels of self-esteem, lower anxiety, and greater professional success than the general population. They're not deficient in kindness. Often, they're quite emotionally intelligent, precisely because they manage their resources rather than just depleting them. The trap we fall into is assuming everyone needs access to us at all times. Some people genuinely have the capacity to carry the weight of the world and feel energized by it. Others need to ruthlessly protect their time to function, create, and be decent human beings. Neither is wrong, neither is more virtuous. They're just different psychological profiles shaped by trauma, personality, and neurobiology. What matters, according to the research, is honesty. Does your behavior match your reality? Or are you forcing yourself into a martyr role that leaves you feeling drained and passive-aggressive? Because at the end of the day, the psychology of people who can't say no isn't really about politeness at all. It's about understanding that your life belongs to you, and that protecting your peace deserves to be honored rather than apologized for. The person who says no to the dinner party to rest isn't failing. The person with a packed schedule and a resentful heart isn't winning. We're all just trying to find the configuration of service and self-preservation that lets us be most fully ourselves. And sometimes that means choosing the discomfort of a no, even when the world keeps begging for a yes. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, hit that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate your support.